director of the Center for Studying Working Class Life and a professor of economics out at Stony Brook University, and also a national co-convener of U.S. Labor Against the War, and the chair of the New York City chapter of U.S. Labor Against the War. So, U.S. Labor Against the War is an organization that began in the run-up to the war in Iraq in 2003. It has continued and is growing, and now has about 200 central labor councils, union locals, international unions, state federations, and other labor bodies around the country. And we in U.S. Labor Against the War began on the war in Iraq, extended then to Afghanistan, and as the wars have kind of both receded and also multiplied, we are in a situation where in the labor movement, with all the economic crisis that's going on and all the diversion of attention from these wars, we have begun to really focus on not just the wars and how wrong they are, but also how costly they are, and how the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and more broadly, American militarized foreign policy, needs to be challenged by the labor movement as part of a broader public challenge to militarism. Because we just don't accept the usual claim that there's no money. As the budgets are being cut, and as education is being cut, and social services, not just the safety net, but the whole government is being reduced, what we find is the need to really challenge this basic idea that there is no money. Well, of course there's money. We just need to identify where that money is and go get it, and move the money from the pockets of the wealthy, the pockets of the super rich, the pockets of the big corporations who have escaped the burdens of taxation and the joys and pleasures of taxation, I should say also. I remember as I was growing up, my father, who was an immigrant, came to America when he was of working age, and was very disappointed when he found out that he was too poor to pay taxes. He couldn't understand how he could live in a country and not pay taxes. Gradually and eventually he was able to pay taxes, and he was proud of it. So I think that we need to really look at the revenue side of the budget in a different way. But we also have to look at the expenditure side and ask what the values and the priorities of the country are as reflected in that budget, which leads us right to the military budget. The flyer that I've handed out is a list. This comes from the National Priorities Project. And if you do not have this flyer, please raise your hand and we'll get you one. But in fiscal year 2012 that just ended, the people of the city of New York, this is just New York City, sent $4 billion to the federal government, which then went to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. That was the share of the total budget that went to the wars, applied to the total amount of money that New York sent to the government. So we sent $4 billion from New York City in just that 1 year. And the National Priorities Project at the website that you see below has calculated what that money could buy. It's difficult just to wrap your mind around $4 billion. There's a lot of zeros in there. We don't have experience with that. We have experience with what a quart of milk costs or what a pint of ice cream costs, but we don't have experience with $4 billion. So this is a very nice summary. And you'll notice that this is the list of everything that could be bought with that $4 billion. You'll notice plus at the end of every one of these things. This is additive. This is what the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan cost the people of New York City in 1 year of 2012. So when we say we have to end the militarized foreign policy of the United States, this is the beginning of what we're talking about. It's only the beginning because the wars are only the beginning of military expenditures. But it is an indication of the true costs in real terms of the wars. Then if you look at the next little paragraph there, in fiscal 2012, not just from New York City, but from the whole state of New York, we spent $10.3 billion for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which was, incidentally, way more than the annual budget deficit for the state of New York. So for those of us in the public sector, I'm teaching at SUNY, in the City University, Brooklyn Downstate, Litch, which is a private hospital but was merged into the public sector when Brooklyn Downstate took it over. All of those things would not have to be closed, would not be suffering the kind of budget constraints because there's no money at the state level. There is money. We pay that money. We are already paying it on taxes. We don't have to increase anybody's taxes. We just have to redirect what that money is being used for. And you could say, well, gee, nothing says if you cut the military budget that that money would actually come to New York. Well, that's true, except if you remember the stimulus package that passed in 2009, there was about $60 billion of that stimulus package, or maybe more, that was directed to state and local governments so that they could withstand the rigors of the recession. When that stimulus package ended, when that aid to the states ended, which was part of the federal budget, what happened was the layoffs began. The fiscal crisis began in the states and in the municipalities. So we, instead of having stopped the aid to the public, to state and local governments and stopped the war, instead of doing that, we stopped the aid to the public sector and continued the war. It was exactly the wrong thing to do, and we need to reverse that, and we need to say that that's what we want to do. So these will just give you a few numbers. The what is it called here? The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, which is in Sweden, every year issues a report of the military spending around the globe, 172 countries. How much are they spending? Well, it's no surprise that the United States is, of course, the all-time champ, big-time spender in the military budget. Last year, $682 billion. $418 million. $682 billion of military expenditures just last year in the United States, which exceeds the combined military budgets of the next 11 countries, which exceeds the amount of money, and I'll read them in order because I just went and looked at the website. I was curious myself. People's Republic of China is number 2, $166 billion. That's 5 times less than what we spend. Then comes Russia, the UK, Japan, France, Saudi Arabia, India, Germany, Italy, Brazil, and South Korea. We spend more money every year on our military than all those countries put together. So we say it's time for a change, as they say in some circles. So we are now dealing with this sequester. For those who aren't familiar with it, I suppose most of you are. The Congress in 2011 decided that if they couldn't make a budget cut and fix the budget, they were going to impose cuts that were so draconian that no one could possibly imagine going through with it, and that would be the sort of axe over everybody's neck that would get everybody to negotiate. Well, when push came to shove, it didn't quite happen, and here we are with the sequester. So, briefly, the budget, the federal budget, is divided into roughly into 2 parts. There's something called the discretionary budget, and then there is the non-discretionary budget, or the fixed or obligations, sometimes called entitlements, but that's not really quite exactly right. The sequester only applies to discretionary part of the budget. It does not apply to those parts of the budget which do not have to be renewed every year. So it doesn't apply to Social Security, which incidentally is completely outside the federal budget, the usual federal budget anyway. And the idea of bringing Social Security into the discussion of the budget deficit is just a trap and completely incorrect. But we can get into that if you want a little bit more in detail later. Does not include the sequester, does not include Medicare, doesn't include Medicaid, does not include interest on the national debt, doesn't include other things that are fixed by Congress by eligibility, or by law, and then they're set, and you don't have to renew them every year. Those things that you have to renew every year includes the military budget, and it also includes the State Department and the Department of the Interior and the Department of Justice and all the rest of what the government does. So the sequester cuts about half and half of the cuts between the military and the non-military discretionary money, which we should understand is not the social safety net. That's a separate issue. That's a separate set of problems. If we're talking about cutting half out of the non-military discretionary budget, we're talking about the national parks. We're talking about the post office. We're talking about the State Department and the missions around the world. There was all this made about there was no protection for the mission in Benghazi. But Congress cut the money to defend the missions of the State Department around the world. So if you're going to cut the money to defend the State Department missions around the world, you can't very well, although they did, come back and say it's the State Department who was derelict because they didn't provide security. Our government is not providing, and the sequester amplifies that, not just in the State Department, but in education and everything all the way across the board. So when we talk about this sequester and the sequester problem, we need to understand that it is not the entitlement programs. So what we have now is the military takes up, of that discretionary budget, about 58% of the whole discretionary budget of the United States government. That's the military. So when these budget cuts are coming into the military as well as into the non-military parts, they are consequential. Real things are happening, real people are being laid off, real systems are being scrapped, and there are consequences. In the past, we in U.S. law and in the peace movement have argued for a reduction in the defense budget. And I think it's safe to say at this point that there is going to be a reduction in the defense budget. The defense budget, not just because of the sequester, but even in fixing the sequester, everybody in Congress, everybody in the military, everybody in the Department of Defense, the leadership, State Department, all the way up and down, agrees and understands and is planning for significant cuts in the military budget. So I think quite apart from our demands, the pressures that exist around the budget are leading to that reduction in military expenditures. So for us in the labor movement, that raises particular questions. I'm in a teachers union, I'm in the AFT, and for us, it's a good idea to cut the military budget because that means that there's more money available for education, and that's easy enough to make that case. But if we take that to a Central Labor Council, or to the State Fed, the UAW is there, the machinists are there, steel workers are there, American Federation of Government Employees are there, Communications Workers of America. All these are major unions representing workers in the defense industry. And so when we say, cut the budget, we don't need these weapon systems, there are machinists and there are people who are skilled tradespeople all over the country saying, wait a second, you're talking about my job. And those unions that represent them and say, wait a second, just like the United Coal Miners, United Mine Workers of America, UMWA. The United Mine Workers will not support a cap on carbon emissions because they don't want to destroy the job of coal miners. It's a big problem in the labor movement, how to make an argument that can win over and that can bring along the entire labor movement behind an agenda for peace and for the redirection of these resources. So what that has come to mean for us in U.S. Labor Against the War, and I want to bring this to you to think about, is that it becomes very important to talk about military conversion, the conversion of military production and weapons production to civilian purposes. Now, some of you may remember a guy named Seymour Melman, who in the 1960s and 1970s, as a professor of industrial engineering at Columbia University, wrote Pentagon Capitalism and a number of other works that demonstrated how military procurement system and the military budget eroded American industrial capacity. And he was calling for redirection of the funds, and he was calling for the limitations of the military budget and the resurrection of civilian manufacturing. But what he never did was to say how that was going to work, right? How are you actually going to do that so that the people who are going to lose their jobs as machinists are going to be people who can find another job building wind turbines or whatever. So what we are trying to do is to identify as well as we can the mechanisms by which we can design real programs for the conversion of military spending into peaceful uses so that we can bring the labor movement as a whole along on this political journey. So it turns out that the Labor Department, the Commerce Department, and the Defense Department all have grant programs for municipalities and for communities to work on conversion when weapon systems are phased out or when there are these problems of the reduction in military spending in particular areas. This is a problem that the government understands. They want to make resources available to study and to ameliorate those problems. There is a woman at Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., whose name is Miriam Pemberton. And Miriam Pemberton is a research fellow at IPS, and her work is to figure out with communities how to take advantage of those grants and how to design specific programs that can not just move the money, but move the labor force so that jobs are protected. So she is working in two areas in the United States, one up in Lynn, Massachusetts, where there's a GE plant that makes engines for fighter bombers, and then a plant out in Lima, Ohio, that makes Stryker vehicles. Both of these plants are facing significant cutbacks in the military budget. So what Miriam Pemberton is doing is working with the unions that are involved. In Lynn, it's the communications workers, which took over the IUE, the International Union of Electrical Workers. That represents the workers in that engine plant. And then in Ohio, it's a UAW local that represents the workers in that Stryker production facility. So what Miriam is doing is trying to work with those unions, with the local community development and economic development organizations, and the companies, together with these funding agencies, to try to actually design programs that would redirect the industrial activity into work that has a similar skill mix to the mix of the population that's currently working in those plants. It's a very ambitious, but also very exciting and very detailed and specific kind of work that we're going to need to do. And we in U.S. Labor Against the War, the New York City chapter with the Left Labor Project, are bringing Miriam up to talk about this work. And I want to invite everybody to come to it. It's on Wednesday, the 24th of April. And if you can take these and pass them around, that would be good. And it's at PSC, Professional Staff Congress, the union that represents the City University of New York, faculty and professional staff. And information is on the flyer, and we'll also be joined by Bill Shortell, who's the political director for the machinists in New England, and is an active, actually just retired after 26 years in a production facility in Hartford, making aircraft engines as a machinist. So that's going on, and we in U.S. Labor Against the War are glad to be here and glad to be part of the whole community that's asking, well, what kind of a country do we want to be? What kind of a military do we really need? What really constitutes security? Is security having a lot of drones and a lot of bombers and a lot of aircraft, or security having an educated population? Is security having a healthy population? Is security having full employment? We think that security are those things, and that security and the security of the United States is undermined by the kinds of militarized foreign policy that we've been promoting as a country for way too many decades. So I'll stop there, and we'll see where the discussion goes in the questions. Thank you.
Okay, my name is Mark Dunlea, and I'm Executive Director of the Hunger Action Network of New York State, which I'll come back to in a second. I'm also co-convener of the No Grand Bargain Coalition here in New York City.
No bad grand bargain.
Oh, no, well, I don't even like a Grand Bargain Coalition. But that was a coalition, actually it's more of a network, but it was about 50 organizations that came together, mainly initially more senior citizen-based organizations who were concerned about protecting Social Security and Medicare from the threats. And they invited me in because of some work I've done in the past, particularly around single-payer health care, and I convinced them we should also examine the other programs, such as safety net programs, such as food stamps, housing, and we've also been fortunate to get some of the peace organizations, particularly United States, U.S. Labor Against War, to come in and also talk about the military budget part of it. So I'll go back to the Hunger Action Network. We're 31 years old. Started right after this guy named Ronald Reagan became president. And if you had told us 31 years later we'd still be here, we would have said that we had failed to do our job. You know, hunger was not a significant problem in the United States in the late 70s because of the advent of programs like food stamps and school meals, WIC, and then the 1981 Reagan budget cuts came along, which slashed spending across the board, and particularly slash spending for public housing programs and Section 8 programs. And in New York City, we did not know how many food pantries and soup kitchens, we do in New York City in 1980. There were about 30 food pantries and soup kitchens in the entire city. We don't know how many there are statewide. Today's about 1,300, and most of those were created in the first 10 years after the Reagan budget cuts. And we thought we were sort of temporary. You know, a generation has grown up with soup kitchens and food pantries that's at 1,000 points of light. It's something they've always known, but in fact it was a relatively rare phenomenon. And we've grown and grown and grown. And today there's 1,300 here in New York City and about 1.3 million people we feed on an annual basis in New York City. About 40% of which are the working poor, about a third are children, and surprisingly about 20% are senior citizens. That's been the big growth in the last 10 years. There's been senior citizens becoming poor. And Hunger Action Network has always been we primarily focus at the state level, though we have done some work in recent years at the federal level because of programs like food stamps and the child nutrition programs. The Hunger Action Network has always been one of the leaders in the revenue campaigns in New York State at the state level, working with groups like the Fiscal Policy Institute and Strong Economy for All. And people always ask, why is Hunger Action Network so focused on revenue? Well, because since we basically representing low-income New Yorkers, poor people are always the last one to get the money from the public treasury. And so whenever there are cuts at the state level in revenues, it's always poor people who bear the brunt of those cuts. And then when the economy rebounds and more money flows into the state coffers, it's always the anti-poverty programs are the last ones to be restored. And for instance, those cuts in 1980 have not been restored, particularly to the housing programs. So, because of that, Hunger Action has been very active in issues like closing corporate tax loopholes and the millionaire's tax and trying to make the income tax more progressive. We have a state tax system in New York State where the janitor at Trump Tower pays more of his or her income for state and local taxes than Donald Trump does, and that's unfair. And we do the same thing recently at the federal level. So we've always approached, personally I am active with the Fort Greene Peace, and been a long-time peace activist before I moved to Brooklyn. But Hunger Action Network, we oppose war, but primarily we oppose the military budget. And we've been probably one of the more vocal groups in New York State trying to cut military spending. We want a peace dividend. We never got that after World War II, we never got that after the Korean War, we never got that after the Vietnam War, we certainly didn't get that after, well, I guess the wars have not ended. Eisenhower, when he left office, or before he left office, even though he was, kind of intimate in creating the military-industrial complex, he also warned people about the dangers. But his most famous quote in terms of what we work on is that every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final sense a theft from those who are hunger and are not fed, and those who are cold and are not clothed.
Immune diseases. But we were able to take some recombinant protein, which was not so easy to get back then, and document that lupus patients, shown on the bottom here, had a significant proliferative response. T cells from those patients had a proliferative response to a protein in the ribosomal P protein. And what you see on the top is a healthy individual where they were showing a very nice response to tetanus toxoid, but very little response to the recombinant ribosomal protein. So this was, again, one step along the way to documenting the role of the immune system, antigen-specific T cell responses in autoimmunity and autoimmune disease. Another step along the way was to understand how those T cells were regulated, and then what was the impact of T cell activation on other components of the immune response. And this is just a diagram to kind of demonstrate that reciprocal help that antigen-presenting cells, including activated B cells, can provide to T cells through this co-stimulatory molecule pair, and then the capacity through this pair, CD40 ligand or CD154 and CD40 on target cells, B cells, macrophages, dendritic cells, that these all work together to help the immune system kind of ramp its activity up. But you can imagine that if these two and other co-stimulatory pairs are not properly controlled, that you can have a situation where you've got excessive activation of the immune system and potentially autoimmunity. So we studied the regulation of CD40 ligand, and I won't go into detail there, but we looked at the regulation at multiple levels. But what came out of all that was the hypothesis that CD40 ligand might be a good therapeutic target. And I guess I don't have time to go into all of the sad details, but there were very promising studies about 10 years ago using a monoclonal antibody to CD40 ligand that were briefly successful in terms of gaining control over autoantibody levels and some clinical manifestations of disease. But this antibody caused thrombosis, and the development program was halted. Currently, there are new, 10 years later, new development programs to try to target CD40 ligand through other approaches. It remains, I think, an extremely promising therapeutic target for really any disease in which T cells are overactivated or giving excessive helper signals to target cells. Now, I mentioned that technology to some extent drives our observations, and about 10 years ago, or a little longer, microarray technology came about, and we studied the peripheral blood of lupus patients and made this observation that the type 1 interferon-inducible genes were overexpressed, leading us to kind of go back over the history of lupus immune defects and kind of pull out of that several of these observations that suggested that type 1 interferon might be a very important mediator in the disease. And we went on to characterize a group of lupus patients in whom this was particularly true, leading to the idea that nucleic acid containing immune complexes are particularly good drivers of type 1 interferon production, and particularly those immune complexes that contain RNA. And so this is, I think this is my last figure in this series to try to kind of tell you and sum up my current thinking about self-reactivity in the context of a systemic autoimmune disease like lupus. Now, ordinarily we have this very nicely regulated immune system where we have cells that do perceive self-cells, self-non-T cells, but those cells kind of keep things in balance to some extent through generating some regulatory T cells and other approaches. But if you have either exogenous access to exogenous adjuvant type factors, as you might have when you get a microbial infection, or endogenous adjuvant type factors, as might occur when nucleic acids are available in excess or for some reason can become stimulatory, you can get production of something like interferon that drives activation and sort of a shift in functional phenotype of antigen-presenting cells in a way that they're able to drive that T cell activation further and even direct it toward some of the peptides, some of the components to which those dendritic cells have gained access. So this is kind of a general picture, but I think it's true. I think that we have a very carefully regulated immune system, and you can disturb that regulation in a number of ways, but I think an important mechanism is the role for adjuvant type factors in making antigen presentation much more effective. So we've asked the question, I guess I did have one more in this series. What drives the production of interferon alpha? Well, we've thought a lot about the role of genetics. And I think many of you are aware of the proliferation of genome-wide association studies, and certainly genetic susceptibility, we feel, is very important in the fact that one individual more than another might tend to produce more type 1 interferon, might have that susceptibility to driving their immune system activation. And this is just a figure from a paper published by one of my rheumatology fellow, prior colleagues, who's continues to be a collaborator, Tim Newald, a really terrific physician scientist. What he did was to dig into our serum bank from lupus patients and their families and study type 1 interferon activity in the patients as well as in their healthy, unrelated individuals, and show that there was significantly more interferon activity in some of these family members, suggesting a genetic role. And then he's gone on to look at particular lupus-associated genes, the risk haplotypes, and show that some of those gene variants in the innate immune system pathways are associated with increased production of interferon. So I think I'm going to skip that. So this was, I had the opportunity to write a review and commentary in the New England Journal about 2 years ago that was a great opportunity to kind of try to synthesize all of these different roles of the immune system and how the genetic observations that were coming out at the time and continue to come out play out at the level of immune dysregulation. So now we're putting interferon kind of at the center of the immune dysregulation that we see. But this observation, and again, in addition to CD40 ligand, I think interferon is a very appropriate therapeutic target. Is sort of, this trajectory is started with a study of self-reactivity, and I think, or I hope, will end with some new therapies for our patients. So just in the last few slides, I just want to mention some other important career drivers, I guess, that have been very important to me. I'm just listing some organizations that I've been very involved in. And, to me, service is, to the field really, is as important as my own research, because, the only way you're going to really, I think, make a big impact is by interacting with our colleagues and putting work into making the whole field be more successful. So obviously HSS has been my institution for a number of years. I'm completely committed to it, and I think it's a wonderful place where, I don't think anyone really wants to leave HSS once they're there. Now I'm the physician-in-chief, which is bringing up all sorts of new responsibilities, but all of it's very interesting, time-consuming, but I think that time is always well spent. I've been involved in many external foundations, NIH study sections, and while I think sometimes students are instructed not to become overcommitted, and I might get shot down for this, but I would say I think it's great to be overcommitted if you have the energy, because you just kind of broaden your horizons, you have more impact, and I would say be as committed as you can handle. And then just finally, I'm not to be so 100% upbeat. We have many challenges. I think there's obviously financial challenges for physician scientists, for medicine in general. And, we're all going to have to find ways of working around those challenges. For junior faculty, it's particularly difficult in that those years, after residency, after fellowship, are particularly difficult to find funding to support if you want to go into a research career. But I think we have to work in many ways to find that funding. And strategies, I think partnerships and collaboration are really the answer. And I'm always sort of a juggler. I do what I need to do and set up interactions with whoever I need to in order to keep my lab going, keep myself going. And if you communicate and work together, I think there's always a way to support your research if it's worth supporting. And then, I put patients last. Obviously they go first, but I think everything's really for the patients. It's our interest in research is to get us to understanding how we can help the patients more, and then just at the personal level, even for those of us who spend 80-85% of our time in research or administration, it's always a good kind of grounding that the patients provide for us to remind us of what's really important, and to have some great discussions and friends, really. So I'll stop there. I hope that I've given you some sense of kind of a crazy wandering career, but it kind of makes sense to me, and hopefully it's been productive and helpful to the field. So thanks.
Thank you. So there are and is time for questions or comments. Anyone? Yes, here in the back. Can you just introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Ashwin Patel. I'm a rising fourth year MD PhD student. And I was curious about if you had experienced maybe more failure when you were in the lab in the beginning, when you hadn't gotten the publications, how would have that potentially changed your trajectory, your decisions?
You know, I think that's a good question because, I mean, that, I can't, that JEM paper had a big impact. So, you know, I had that paper when I was really a technician, or it was probably published when I was a first year student. And if I hadn't had that, I don't know if I would have been accepted into Henry Kunkel's lab. So, you know, one thing leads to another. But I guess my answer is, if I hadn't had some, you know, almost fortuitous observations, maybe giving myself a little credit because I was particularly attentive to them, to pick up on them. But, you know, I maybe a couple years later I would have had another observation. I think having a mentor who was supportive and encouraging and giving me independence was so important. So I guess my answer is, if you don't at first succeed, make sure you have the right mentor, the right setting, and chances are, you know, one of the next couple of tries will be more successful. I think mentoring is really important.
Other questions or comments? Yes.
About 45 years ago, I was in pediatric practice, and I got to know Dr. German, James German, and I worked in his lab at Rockefeller University studying human karyotype. And some years later, after chromosome study became more sophisticated, his banding and involvement in prenatal diagnosis, especially of Down syndrome and other things, such as Fragile X syndrome and trisomy 18. And anyway, some years after that, after I left that, Dr. German told me triumphantly that now he came to understand the new genetic engineering, that is, the vocabulary of molecular biology, the genes themselves, in addition to Mendelian genetics and so on. My question to you is, it seems to me that you came into this before or after that revolution of genetic engineering and understanding of genes, and have you had to try to get a running start to understand all this, which I don't really understand, even in the New England Journal?
I've thought about that. There's no doubt that I was not formally trained in molecular biology. You know, my lab environment was more cellular immunology, and that's what there was in the 1970s. And, you know, getting into the 1980s, when more molecular techniques were being developed, I sort of felt, you know, incompetent relatively. You know, I don't really know how to do those things. I don't really understand how my colleagues are doing them. I guess I figured I could learn if I needed to. But I think what's happened is the techniques have become almost so, you know, maybe cookbook isn't exactly the right word, but accessible. How about accessible? That now, you know, in my lab, I have, you know, several people who know perfectly well. You just go online, you know, you do a Google search or whatever it is for whatever you want to do, and the resources are so extraordinary that it's become much less intimidating. And I don't have to, you know, do it myself with my own two hands. But I feel much more competent in the you know, in the understanding the applications, and even how the techniques are done. I think because of the resources that we have available to us. So it's much easier to master those techniques now technically, and certainly to understand them, than it was 25 years ago. So I don't think it's really a barrier. I think even those who are not trained specifically during their, you know, training period in those techniques can deal with them.
So very
Peggy, that was a terrific talk and really a very exciting progression.